What can happen, happens.
Good to go.
Social death and address. I write to you from the predicament of Blackness. You see, I've been here all my life and found on the atomic level, it's impossible to walk through most doorways. I can, however, move through walls. I write to you from the empty seat that isn't empty. I write to you when a feel is copped. I write myself out of bed. I write to you as the spook who sat by the door. I write to you from Olivia Pope's apolitical mouth. I am here because I could never get the hang of body death, though it has been presented to me like one would offer a roofied cocktail or high interest loan. I am only here because I started eating again. I am only here because I am ineligible to exist otherwise. I am only here because I left and returned through an Atlantic wormhole. I write to you as the American version of me. In the American version, Orpheus's lyre is a gun. Eurydice thinks of doctors, or rather, a cold hand. It feels like one is sliding its sterile nails over the curtains of her womb. Once, a healer's hands passed through my flesh, and I went on trial for stealing 10 fingers. When my spoon scrapes the bottom of a bowl, it sounds like a choir of siblings naming stars after their favorite meals. Physicists are classifying new matters and energies every day. Dark matter, black flesh are in high demand, and we never see a penny. I urge you, if you see a sister walk through walls or survive the unsurvivable, sip your drink and learn to forget or love the taxed apparition before you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. We have just heard from Zan Phillips, the Creative Writing Fellow of the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics, who read their inaugural poem, Social Death and Address. Zan is an award-winning poet and visual artist and has been recognized in many ways for their very important and inspiring work. So Zan, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your work with us. I am Professor William Carter, and it's a privilege to welcome you all here to the inaugural event for the Law School Center for Civil Rights and Racial Justice. I want to thank you all for being here, those of you who are with us remotely, as well as those who are here in person. I also want to thank the Everly Foundation and the Heinz Foundation for their support of this important new center. In addition, I'd like to extend our thanks as well to the faculty, staff, and students of Pitt Law, to the Pitt Law Dean's Office, to our partners throughout the university, and our partners from the community. The Center for Civil Rights and Racial Justice is the culmination of years of planning and ambition by the Pitt Law community. In shaping the center's work, we have been guided by 3 key principles. First and foremost, as an institution of higher learning, our work is guided always by the principle that all we do must advance our students' education. Secondly, as an institution of lawyers and law students, we seek to promote and protect the core legal value of equal justice under law by engaging in work that advances the civil rights of all persons. And last, in pursuing the 2 foregoing goals, we have been guided by the principle of service to, and more importantly, partnership with the community, and in particular, the communities that are most affected by unequal access to justice and inequities in the legal system. The lecture series, of which tonight's event is but the first installment, is one of several initiatives that the center hopes to pursue. We plan to also develop a suite of interdisciplinary experiential learning opportunities in the areas of civil rights and racial justice in order for our students to be able to bring their knowledge to bear in addressing real-world problems. To develop a pipeline project that would encourage and support students from underserved communities to enter law school in the legal profession. To develop a community scholars program whereby persons in the community who are doing this work on the ground can partner with the law school and the university to support their work, and to develop programs providing support for our students, faculty, and staff to develop new courses, service projects, and to engage in cutting-edge legal research in the areas of civil rights and racial justice. In sum, we're just getting started. We hope that you'll stay tuned and join us in this important work. It's now my pleasure to introduce Vice Chancellor Clyde W. Pickett, who will share a few words with us. I believe Clyde is with us by Zoom.
I am indeed. Thank you, Professor Carter. Good evening. Good to be with you. On behalf of the Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, I wish to extend my welcome for your participation and attendance this evening, and a nod to our colleagues for not only putting together this program, but launching the Center for Civil Rights and Racial Justice, an opportunity for us to create a center whose mission is to facilitate community-engaged teaching, research, and service that will serve as a hub and indeed an anchor to the law school's commitment to legal issues related to civil and human rights. The center is set to serve as a community beacon of resource that fosters competence and collaboration on civil rights and racial justice initiatives. This is the crystallization of an effort of key stakeholders to advance the institutional agents of change and the university's mission to promote a culture of equity and inclusion and to catalyze and disseminate information and for the greater good of society and indeed our community. We are grateful as a university for Pitt Law's effort to engage this work and to help lead us in changing the region. Special appreciation to the center's co-directors, Professor Velez Martinez and Professor Carter, for their work now and the work that will come, and certainly to all those who were involved, including Dean Wilder, for the help. We thank you, and we will be better and are better for all of your efforts. To the community, we encourage you to engage the center. I know that the Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion certainly will, and we see the center as a university resource to continue to advance and develop our efforts for positive social change in our community and beyond. And it is now my pleasure to welcome Felicity A. Williams, Esquire, who is with us to offer remarks. Ms. Williams is a racial and economic justice advocate, passionate about politics and community equity, and currently serves the 61st mayorals of Pittsburgh in being the deputy chief of staff. And so we welcome her. We are glad that she is with us and appreciate your time. Ms. Williams, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Well, good evening. It is an honor to be here today on behalf of Mayor Ed Gainey, our 61st mayor and our first Black mayor in the city of Pittsburgh. First off, I want to say thank you to the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, the Civil Rights and Racial Justice Center, this inaugural event for launching this, as well as Professors Sheila Velez Martinez and William M. Carter Jr. for having me here tonight. Based on the bio that the little snippet that you heard about me, you can imagine that the work focus for this center is particularly important to me. I'm a native Pittsburgher. I am someone who I grew up actually right outside of Pittsburgh in an area called Wilkinsburg, which has been in the news quite a bit lately. And I left Pittsburgh for a time. I left Pittsburgh to go to law school. I went to William and Mary, but I am what is called a boomeranger, right? And I excuse me for kind of making up that term there, but I'm gonna go with it. I am a boomeranger who, as I said, left Pittsburgh, but then came back. And one of the reasons that I came back was because I was in law school when the Black Lives Matter movement was formed. And so obviously that had a very deep impact on me to be sitting in criminal law classes, criminal procedure classes, con law classes, and seeing these injustices unfold across the country. And so one of the things that I sat and thought about was, what can I do to contribute to advancing these issues and the things that Black Lives Matter was raising? And so I came back to Pittsburgh and started, working in policy as someone who wanted to take the skills and things that I had learned and bring them back. So just a little bit about why this is so important to me, and I'm really glad to be here with you all tonight. Of course, as part of Pittsburgh, we've all seen the studies, we've read the reports, and live the reality of Pittsburgh as it exists today, that it isn't a city that is livable for all of us. As it exists right now, there are too many barriers for Black and brown folks in our city to find a pathway to prosperity. And if we're going to become a city for all of us, it is going to take all of us working together to take down those barriers. In 2020, we saw the seeds of change being planted here in Pittsburgh. With our minds on justice, the entire city came together to demand racial justice and economic justice and social justice for those that have been left behind in our city. And if we are going to build a diverse, vibrant, thriving city, we need to ensure that everyone who lives here, who works here, who goes to school here can feel safe. Public safety also means public health, and it is up to all of us here to work together to improve the lives and well-being of all of us. One of the things that Mayor Gainey has expressed being very passionate about as an administration is not just talking about issues or having more reports, right? It's about actually taking action, having implementable policy change that we can see real outcomes and results from that move the needle on some of these issues. And so as part of our transition, Mayor Gainey has convened experts, community members, organizers, and activists from across our city and has empowered them to come together to create real, meaningful policies to address these stark inequalities in our city. And so would be remiss if I got up here today and I did not leave you all with a charge to not just be here tonight, not to continue to engage with the center and the activities that they have outlined, but to encourage all of you to visit gaineytransition.com to learn about the work and see how you, as law students, can add your voice to that work. We know that these inequalities aren't going to go away overnight or even in our first term of this administration. We know that we are planting the seeds of justice today that will be harvested over the years and decades to come. And we invite all of you to work with us to build Pittsburgh up into a city for all. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jerry Dickinson, Associate Professor of Law here at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. And I want to thank the Pitt Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, the Office of Health Sciences, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, the Pitt Human Rights Working Group, PublicSource, and the Pitt Center for Civil Rights and Racial Justice for organizing this important event. Tomorrow will mark the 1-year anniversary of the publication of Pittsburgh is America's Apartheid City. In February of 2021, on the 22nd, that piece was published by me in PublicSource. And it was a provocative article, and it generated quite a bit of dialogue throughout the city of Pittsburgh. So I want to give a bit of an overview of the thesis and how this program is going to help to explore further the dynamics of racial injustices in the city of Pittsburgh and find ways to address them moving forward. About 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, I was a human rights activist in South Africa, in Johannesburg. I was a Fulbright scholar there and doing work in the inner city slums and the shanty towns of Joburg. And in one of my meetings with residents in a very poor and densely populated slum called Alexandra, I recall walking through hundreds of different shanty houses. And as I was coming from this meeting with residents, 3 Black South African boys ran up to me. And they were curious as to who I was. They could tell that I was an outsider. They could tell that I was not from Alexandra. And they were curious. And so they threw a tennis ball at me. They were playing around. They were giggling. They were laughing. I stooped down. They rubbed my head. We were laughing, having a good time. And then they kind of ran off on their own. And I lived in South Africa long enough at that moment, for about 1.5 years, to realize that those 3 boys that I had met in this slum in Alexandria were growing up in one of the world's most unequal and inequitable societies, even in post-apartheid South Africa. On indicators of education and health and housing and occupational segregation, they would fall far, far below and behind their white counterparts, even in post-apartheid South Africa. Fast forward 10 years later, and I'm a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, a civil rights lawyer, and a candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives. And I'm crisscrossing the region, meeting voters, meeting people throughout this region, having conversations. I recall being in the Hill District, having a wonderful conversation with a woman about gentrification and housing. And as I'm speaking with her about this issue, in the window to my right, I can see the curtains moving on the inside. And all of a sudden, the curtains open up, and there are 3 children. And they're laughing and giggling at me as I'm sitting there on her porch speaking and talking about housing. And I turn, I look at the kids, and they look at me and they see that I see them, and they quickly close the curtains, they run off. And I can hear them on the inside of the house running around and giggling and having a good time. And the mother is, she's embarrassed. She says, "Oh, don't worry about my kids. They're just being silly." I said, "Don't worry, I have kids of my own. It's okay." And I left that conversation on a somber note. As I went on to my next door to knock to meet a voter, I realized, I said to myself, those 3 children that I just met in the Hill District here in Pittsburgh, they too are growing up in one of this nation's most unequal and inequitable cities. Those 3 children, too, statistically speaking, would fall far behind their white counterparts on education, on housing, on health outcomes, on occupational segregation. And it was at that moment that I said to myself, Pittsburgh may not be the most livable city in America. Pittsburgh may be America's apartheid city. Now, I thought to myself at that moment that that may be unfair. It's a provocative statement to make. Pittsburgh's my hometown, just like Felicity. I love my city, but the reality is there. Pittsburgh is one of the most segregated cities in all the United States. But it's not just the segregation in Pittsburgh that makes it an apartheid city. It's the racial disparities that exist across our segregated landscape. On issues of health, Black maternal health is some of the worst in all the United States, right here in Pittsburgh. Average incomes for Black men is the lowest in all the United States. Okay? I could go on and on and on, but these racial disparities, they exist. And the question becomes, what are we as a city going to do about this? I've said this before, that a successful city and a region mandates that its residents feel that they can identify with the city and feel a moral attachment to that city's fortunes. And right now in Pittsburgh, there are far too many people in the city who do not feel an attachment to the city's fortunes. Then, it is our collective moral imperative, I believe, to end Pittsburgh's apartheid and become a world-class city of racial equality. That is our vision for Pittsburgh. That is our moral imperative. And I have to say this as a father of 2 Black daughters here in Pittsburgh, whether we choose to pursue this type of vision and embrace this moral imperative will be the defining characteristic of our generation. And so moving forward with this series, we're going to have experts, interdisciplinary scholars and practitioners who have been studying these issues for quite some time to come together to have a robust and honest conversation about these racial disparities in Pittsburgh, and then move forward with addressing and solving some of these problems as well. And I'm very much excited to have this opportunity to do this, and excited that the University of Pittsburgh is going to be helping to host this event. With that being said, I have the honor of introducing our keynote inaugural lecturer, Professor Anthony Farley. Professor Farley is the James Campbell Matthews Distinguished Professor of Jurisprudence at Albany Law School. And prior to entering academia, he was an assistant U.S. attorney in the U.S. Office of U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. And prior to serving as a federal prosecutor, Professor practiced law as a corporate securities associate with Sherman and Sterling in New York City. A graduate of Harvard Law School, Professor Farley's scholarship focuses on constitutional law, criminal procedure, and legal theory. And admittedly, it is very difficult to know where to begin when introducing Professor Farley, given all the accolades and the illustrious career that he has had in legal academia, but I will try. The impact of his legal scholarship over the past 2 decades, in many ways is immeasurable, yet far-reaching in its breadth and depth on the legal academy and beyond. Professor Farley's scholarship has captivated audiences with his honest and robust critiques of capitalism, of critical race theory, cultural analysis, and the legal history of slavery. His work has informed and inspired generations of scholars interested in comprehending and understanding how anti-Blackness constitutes the content and form of our modern law in America. Professor Farley's immeasurable impact on legal academia cannot be overstated. Indeed, the breadth and depth of Farley's influence is arguably unmatched in this field of study. His scholarship has been critically engaged in by an extraordinary diverse array of academics and scholars across the globe, including scholars of Afro-pessimism, animal studies, bioethics, civil rights, comparative literature, constitutional law, criminal law, critical race theory, education, and gender studies, and on and on and on. The influence of Professor Farley is extraordinary. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Farley. Thank you.
Thank you. I am honored and pleased beyond measure to be with you today. I'm very excited about the center and very excited to be part of the series that you have planned. And I hope to be able to answer questions that you'll undoubtedly have after my talk. Slavery is death only, and that continually. Law, the law you are studying, is the body of this death. The pursuit of justice, and therefore of equality, is the pursuit of law. Law, however fair in form, even when it comes to us seemingly as justice, cannot be a force for anything other than the reproduction of the death that gave birth to it. Legal relations are relations between people regarded as if some of those people were things. What is it we see in justice? My talk, I hope, will locate the dark design of our love of justice in the relationship we have to capital. Before there is law, there is trauma. Law is the repetition of its own inaugural event, the event that inaugurates the law and is its mystical source of authority, repeated as rule of law, repeated as equal protection, repeated as due process, repeated as justice, is murder. Law begins with the violence of tens of millions of murders and worse on an impossible and therefore incomprehensible and therefore traumatic scale. The illusory world of legal relations requires the smashing of the real. There is a middle passage, an undiscovered country, the end of the world, and the beginning of another. The end of the real is the beginning of law. The original accumulation, these original accumulations of capital, the original accumulations that began the modern world, was a fatal shattering of the commons into master and slave and all manner of scattered diversities. Capital is born, Marx writes, dripping from head to toe from every pore with blood and dirt. Common flesh is divided, rent, and marked as white over black. For ownership, white. For dispossession, black. The marking, the beginning of diversity, and the tens of millions of murders it represents, genocide in the Americas, colonialism in what's now called the Third World, and, Marx writes, the conversion of Africa into a commercial hunting ground for the gathering of black skin. The tens of murders, millions of murders it represents is traumatic, this marking, this beginning of diversity. The scattered fragments of subjectivity run away. Unfortunately, the fragments run away by way of repetition, white over black to white over black to white over black. I talk about slavery in the present tense because we haven't left it. They'll tell you we've made progress, but they are lying to themselves and to you. Slavery to segregation to neo-segregation is not progress. It is white over black to white over black to white over black. And that is the motionless movement of slavery as it perfects itself. It's the life within the crypt that is the body of law that you are studying as law students. Law is the body of this death that we have already died and are traumatized by. Capital is another word for the reproduction of the violence of the original accumulation. Sweating blood and filth from every pore from head to toe, Marx characterizes not only the birth of capital, but its progress at every step. In the original accumulation, people are separated from the means and methods by which they had traditionally kept themselves alive. This original accumulation is a thing that occurs within history, but it's also a presupposition of the logic of capital. There is capital, therefore there was a prior capital, therefore a prior capitalization, and so forth, until the first hoard, the original accumulation. The fragments of the original accumulation, the fragments of the gathering of the major hordes, genocide in the Americas, colonialism, and the conversion of Africa into a commercial hunting ground for the gathering of black skins. The fragments of that original accumulation seemingly relate to each other according to contract rather than force or force of traditional privileges. This is what they tell us. Status to contract, this is some improvement. Each fragment having no past and no existence outside the market is just like every other fragment. Each fragment is assumed to be a possessor of commodities, and as such, a faithful reflection of every other fragment. Each fragment reflects to all the others only what the mirror of the market will allow, and the market only allows exchanges between exchangers as exchangers. Equal exchange between equals on freely agreed terms, meeting of minds and hearts, but not bodies, not histories. Of course, some of these agents only have a very limited agency because they have only their bodies to sell. That is, they sell their labor power, and selling your labor power means selling yourself, because when you're selling your labor power, you're selling the laborer, you're selling the skin that you are in. So traumatized, literally beside or outside of themselves, the fragments sell their lives, their labor power, as if their lives were objects, mere things to be sold, and not, in fact, their souls. What psychoanalysts like Sandor Ferenczi write of individuals who have undergone trauma is true writ large of the shock of the original accumulation and the shocking exchange, life or death. In other words, living labor, the labor that we, the living, perform, in exchange for dead or previously accumulated labor. The way we, who work, bow down to these vast mountains of capital that were accumulated, first in genocide, in colonialism, and in slavery. And then after that first moment, forever. If the shocks increase in number, Ferenczi writes, in the development of the child, and I would add of the developing society, the number and various kinds of splits in the personality increase too, and soon it becomes extremely difficult to maintain contact without confusion with all the fragments, each of which behaves as a separate personality. It doesn't know of the existence of the others. Eventually, it may arrive at a state which one would be justified in calling atomization. This atomized individual is the modern individual, the one that we're told is ideal, the reasonable person of jurisprudence. The fragments, thus giving up the work, do the propaganda work of capital, and free only in the fantasy world of the market, free only in the fantasy world of the market, a fantasy that becomes the world, set themselves to the task of realizing their freedom within a context that can only give rise to heavier and tighter chains. What's the content of the split off ego, the fragment, in my words, split off ego in Ferenczi's? In Sandor Ferenczi's, quote, above all, a tendency, perhaps the tendency to complete the action interrupted by shock. In order to be able to do this, a refusal to take notice of the injustice suffered. Assertion by means of wish fulfillment, by means of wish fulfilling mental images, by day and by night of what one considers just. In other words, ideational cognitive material, but limited with a tendency to repeat and try to find a better solution. We repeat. When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the slide where I stop and I turn and I go for a ride till I get to the bottom when I see you again. I'm cleverly referencing the Beatles' White Album and Helter Skelter to give you an idea of slaughter, not just the Manson family, but slaughter on the tens of millions, the unimaginable scale of the original accumulation of capital, and the way that trauma settles itself in hearts and minds as an impossibility, an impossible gap between event and narrative. That's what trauma is. What we can't remember is what we repeat, and we repeat this original trauma in terms of the economy, in terms of law, and most peculiarly and poignantly in race relations law. I'll say this part twice because this is important how it works. So maybe I'll say it in a doubled way. We don't all labor within the market as one. We're all exploited, but some of us are exploited in an even weirder way. We bear upon our bodies the stamp of this original accumulation. The moment race is created is the moment of genocide, of colonialism, and slavery. And we bear the marks of that original accumulation on our bodies. The Black is a sign of dispossession, as are all the other diversities created by that world-smashing event that inaugurates capital. The Black worker has a particular and peculiar function to play in the rule of capital over all of our lives, this rule of dead accumulated labor, over living labor, this rule of stuff they gathered through murder over our lives. How does it work that they who inherit all these murders rule over the living? Well, they own the means of production, and we don't. We own only our labor power. And some of us who own only our labor power are stamped for a peculiar dispossession that the market denies committing. The market says everyone in the market is looked at as a point of light, an equal bargainer. Yes, some of you are Monsanto or Xerox or Kodak or Ford or GM, and others of you are just Tom, Dick, Harry, Jane, Sally, Ann. Some of you own the means of production, some of you don't, and those bargains, those of you who've taken contracts know this. When is there equal bargaining power between worker and capital? Never. But the law can't admit that, and that's the peculiarity of law, what it can't admit. There's another thing it doesn't admit, except when there's a crisis, that it has baked in an inherent weight over Blackness. We all remember this world-smashing event in the form of repetition. When we see the sign of who's supposed to be dispossessed, we dispossess that person. The dispossessed may gather together under the sign of their diversity, and they may say, let's lobby for equal rights, we who inherited slavery or colonialism or the genocidal attack. Let's create our picture of a new egalitarian tomorrow in the form of a legislative act or an act of legislation, an executive order, a courtroom victory. Fine, we'll do it in the form of words. The words will always have gaps, conflicts, and ambiguities. When we bend our knee in prayer for legal relief, showing our masters a picture of a pretty tomorrow, they interpret it according to their own lights. And in their lights, we are the inheritors of dispossession. So how does that work? You win the day for a new act of legislation. You win the day in court. You win the day with an executive order. It is in the form of a text. That text is filled with gaps, conflicts, and ambiguities that will be interpreted against you by the power. We are not the power, or we wouldn't be on bended knee praying for legal relief. They are the power. And the powers that be despise us, or we wouldn't need the act of legislation. We wouldn't need the executive order. We wouldn't need the courtroom victory. So when those who loathe you look at the new text, your newest sermon, your newest prefiguration of equality to come, they interpret it against you. And all you'll have lost at the end, when you've won the battle in the legislature, in court, in the executive office, what you'll have lost is the critical consciousness that got you to organize, because you're limiting your organization, limiting your creativity, limiting your imagination to a temple set up to destroy you, this temple of law made up of these traumatic fake relations between people treated as if people were things. Well, accumulation of capital on a world scale is made possible, as I've said, by world-smashing violence, the violence that destroys all scales and measures, the violence that collapses all reasons. The violence of the original accumulation cannot be understood within the horizon of its trauma, that is to say, within the juridical horizon. Violence we cannot comprehend is violence we cannot remember, so nothing is forgotten, nothing is ever really lost. The violence we cannot remember is the violence we repeat. Law is the archive of our dispossession, the mode of our compulsive return to the primal scene of accumulation in the form of its repetition. Justice does not bear witness to her own birth. Justice cannot bear to witness her own birth. Justice cannot face such a violent scene, and so the goddess justice blinds herself and arms herself. Facing her own becoming with unseeing eyes, justice bears witness to her origins, her primal scene, only in the mode of repetition, only in the mode of reproduction, only through the act of giving birth to the self-same violence by which she was created. We see it wildly and wantonly in Crime and Punishment. We see it most vividly in Crime and Punishment. It's with Crime and Punishment that both the juridical element first and most crudely detaches itself from everyday life and becomes fully autonomous. Real law is created in criminal courts, said Pashukanis, before he was executed by Stalin. Pashukanis, author of the general theory of law and Marxism. The law enters the world through the slave struggle for equal justice under law. Slavery enters the world through a blood-stained gate. The gate is as wide as the world, but it is not the world. The gate was opened with the unspeakable murders and mutilations of the Middle Passage, and it is repeated through law. The slave tries to escape, but he runs in the direction of law, slavery's mirror kingdom. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, the master will recognize the slave as an equal. There is therefore no need for today's general strike. That is what the slave's juridical strivings, its fidelity to the legislator, its prayers for relief, seek consciously and unconsciously to always say. The master's world and rule is without end, and slavery never comes to an end, not so long as the slave continues to pray for legal relief. Slaves strive for equality under law and thereby ensure the rule of law, the sovereignty of death, the rule of accumulated dead labor over the lives of those who labor forever. Equal justice under law is slavery, that is to say, death, only death, and that continually. The search for equivalence. Equivalence can be anything at all, and that's exactly what's denied whenever this principle of equivalence is deployed. We see it vividly, as I said, in criminal court. How many weeks does a stolen bicycle weigh? These are the insanities that we contemplate in criminal court instead of abolition, which is conceivable and therefore achievable by us. We pursue punishment, though we know that punishment has never produced a better person. And so when we pretend we are measuring things like punishment, what we are doing is opening the floodgates to that ocean of blood that was spilled in the original accumulation. We're allowing the irrational trauma stuff of this pre-life of capital to flood back in. that before there's law, there's violation. Violence, wrote Pashukanis, begins as a biological fact, but later becomes law. It doesn't make it not violence. Pashukanis wrote that vengeance in the animal world might be described as self-defense, where there's a time between the initial shock and the defensive maneuver. He locates violence in the blood feud, the clan strife from generation to generation. Every offense is a new ground for blood violence, for vengeance that knows no limit. The original accumulation and its creation of the diversities is a blood feud, a vengeance that knows no limit. Blood must be replayed with blood, and it's infinite blood, because the anger is infinite. Those of us who have come across racism understand the infinite anger. When you take micro or macro or some other discipline filled with lies, you will read about concepts like diminishing marginal utility, and you'll think to yourself, well, there's no diminishing marginal utility for slavery. The 10 millionth N-word is just as deeply satisfying to the speaker as is the first. Race is a fetish. It feels good, almost like money to the racist to be racist. And the target of that racism can herself or himself get caught up in it by only pretending to himself or herself to fight against it. The way we pretend to fight against it is by limiting our battle against it initially to only the machinery of law. We've got to work within the system. We have to master the system. When the lid is about to blow off, and that is the only time that the system listens to the people marked by diversities. When the lid is about to blow off for the whole system, the spokesperson for the folks who are looking to end the rule of dead or accumulated capital over living labor, particularly the most brilliant spokespeople who are always the ones most abused, and that would be the ones marked as Black, the ones marked by diversities, the ones marked for dispossession, will say through their spokespersons, here's what equality should look like now, and now you listen to us because things are falling apart. The equality for the future should look like this legislative act, look like this executive order, look like this courtroom victory. And we now hand it over to you, to the power, to interpret and implement. You, the power, will, of course, interpret it against us. And so we will go no further. But the lid that was about to blow off won't blow off. And so the braver, newer world we might have been about to form, the one that might have been around the corner, the one that was being birthed in the crisis, is again left unborn. Right, we get excited sometimes by miscarriages of justice. The public accounting said to have gone awry. Justice is said to have miscarried. Something has gone wrong. A failure of due process, failure of equal protection. Too many years were assigned to this criminal, or too few. Maybe equality and due process were protected, but actual innocence was punished anyway. This is a world of illusory relations, this being the body of law that we must leave. We know how to leave it. Every time 2 or 3 people gather together to feed the hungry, bring water to the thirsty, to clothe the ones in rags, to welcome the refugee, to bring healthcare to the sick, to visit the prisoner and free him or her from the abomination of desolation. We know that we are enough and as good to do things another way, to take each other's needs as our imperatives and to form other associations as need be to free us from this false world we are now in.
Thank you, Professor Farley. Now, I hope you've seen why Professor Farley's work has impacted, influenced so many areas and fields of study in the United States. And I hope you stay with us longer so we can have a conversation with the panel about Professor Farley's presentation and also take some questions from the audience. Oh, I am Sheila Velez Martinez. I'm the co-founding director of the Center for Civil Rights and Racial Justice. I'm also a clinical professor at the Immigration Law Clinic here at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. And I have the pleasure to lead the discussion of Professor Farley's work with Jamil Bey, who's the founder, president, and CEO of UrbanKind Institute. He has a PhD from Penn State. We will not hold that against him today. Maybe at a football game, but not today. The UrbanKind Institute is on a mission to promote political, economic, housing, educational, and social justice through empowering communities. So welcome, Dr. Bey. We will also be hearing from Michelle Reed-Vasquez. Michelle has a very, very long resume that I'll try to summarize. She is an associate professor in the Department of African Studies. She leads the Afro-Latinidad Studies Initiative here at the University of Pittsburgh. She is the founding director of the Center for Ethnic Studies and a prolific author on Caribbean and Afro-Latinidad. So we're really happy to host both of you. And I wanted to ask you if you had initial reactions, Michelle, to Professor Farley's lecture today.
I have so many notes here, but I will say one, I now really see why the draw of certain disciplines to his work, particularly Afro-pessimism. And so for me, I think I was really looking for, I'm not an Afro-pessimist, I'm an Afrofuturist. And so I was really intrigued by all the things that preceded kind of his closing comment about free us from this false world. And that for me was really, I was like, okay, now we could talk. Because there's so much that he talked about in terms of the law and capital and accumulation and the trauma. And I'm always looking for a way out of that. I think that's where I was. So I was really, really engaged throughout and really looking for that piece of hope and within all of it. And I think that for me has been, it's embedded in the work that I do. But I completely, but everything else resonated because it's so true. It is what has happened historically for centuries upon centuries. And I think the articulation of that and embedded within the way that the framework of the law works, I think is really critical to continue to understand and to keep repeating that so we do hear it. Often those things get lost and we move on to something else, but to putting that framework, making it clear every time that's at the core. That's what we have to do to get out and find that glimmer of hope, to change, to free us from the false world. So that was my first reaction.
Thank you, Michelle. Dr. Bey, it seems from Professor Farley's lecture that the path toward justice is outside of the law. And that path seems to be framed as how we actively engage with all of us, the dispossessed. So what, from your perspective, as someone that has been working with community-based organizations, how do community-based organizations and activists tackle these challenges? I think we can't hear you.
Wait, was that question directed for me?
For Dr. Bey.
Oh, okay.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the invite first. But one of the things, from as in this community-based organization work, and our work in particular, we try to engage as broad a spectrum of people, from, Jerry, who we frequently work with, people at the academy, people in community organizations, people in government, recognizing that we need a broader intersectional approach. But one phrase that really stuck with me, out of this original accumulation of capital as a framework that I hadn't thought about. So much right now of the buzz work, this anti-racist work that we're doing, that original accumulation of capital so succinctly puts into perspective the work that we have to do. That anti-racist work would be to disrupt that accumulation. Now, how do we disrupt that accumulation within these institutions, within this framework? If the rules and the institutions are designed to maintain this order and these structures, and the anti-racist work would mean to restore, make right, repair the harm and the damage to Africa, to the Caribbean countries, to South America, to Asian countries, Black and brown people all over the world who've been harmed by this, who continue to be raped. And now you're asking those folks and holding them to the same standards of people like the Mellons, the Carnegie, who've accumulated that mass, but we continue to watch, we continue to allow, we continue to praise. When we see, look at Elon Musk's worth, wow, that's so impressive what he continues to do. When the anti-racist work is, we have to disrupt that what permits that. And I think that's the work in the community-based organizations. We're grappling with, well, how do we do this work inside of these institutions? And we're not making progress. We might alleviate some suffering in the short term, but as far as disrupting these cycles and these structures, the white over black, I like that reframe. We can't disrupt it with these institutions.
So Michelle, how can institutions of higher education, like where you're set, have an impact? What is their responsibility? What's the onus on institutions of higher education?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, a question that many of us grapple with. Part of it is this notion of disruption, thinking, I mean, beyond the box, outside the box is a whole other, it's more of just tearing the box down and rebuilding it to a certain extent. But I think obviously it's about making sure that the students and all their intersectionalities, that they have representation, that they see themselves reflected in the faculty, reflected in the work that the material that they're reading, throughout the syllabus, with the staff that they see at the university, that there has to be that kind of representation. And I say it in part because I had a conversation with another institution. I said, wow, you've done such a great job. And you have a really high and very diverse student body, 60% students of color. But I said, but your faculty doesn't reflect anything like that. And they said, well, we can't talk about race here. We don't, that's not what we do in this state as a public institution. And I just thought, how could that needs to be disrupted like that? You can't tout this and then ignore this other part. So I think part of it is that higher education has to be willing to see what's right before them. I had a conversation with the Asian American Pacific Islander students who are looking to have more representation within faculty who deal with issues of history and kind of literature and all those kind of cultural pieces, because they found themselves represented in elements in the sciences, for example, in the med school, but not in areas where they could actually grasp more of their cultural history and understanding. And so that's been, well, how does the university deal with that when there is representation, but it's not in the places which you want it, which students are saying, we want to see it here. We see it over there. We know it's there. We need it over here. And again, looking for ways to disrupt that. And talking with the students, they would say things like, we've been trying to get this changed for 2, 3, 4 years now. We're about to graduate. What are we supposed to do about this? And part of it is looking at, going back to the structures, to these continuous cycles of how things are done in academia, but also reminding them that they have opened the door They have created this hope and this light that finally faculty, finally the administration is seeing some of these elements. So the sadder part is that it's takes such a long time. But I think to your point about it doesn't, people aren't, those in power aren't willing to see the change until they're about to see the lid blow off. And so that's part of it too. And I think that's what's happening in the last 2 years, 2 to 3 years, where that lid has been blown off. In a lot of ways, it hasn't been responded to in the same way. But I think many institutions of higher education are really trying to take a hard look at how to change at least some of those systemic pieces. I think we have a long way to go, but I think it's certainly more on people's minds now than it was, say, 4 years ago or 5 years ago.
I want to give Anthony an opportunity to react and to have a conversation with Jamil and Michelle before I open the floor to questions from the audience.
Think of my talk as Afro-optimism, not Afro-pessimism, or think of Afro-pessimism as a kind of optimism. That is, these things don't take a long time. Once we realize that time is a manufactured and artificial thing, that we are still in the time produced by the original accumulation, by slavery. We're not living in real time, we're living in fake time. And the fake time, the fake racialized spaces, this fake universe of capital that we're now in is one we have to leave, because there's a moment when fake time, I often call it, following the situation, as spectacular time, runs out in the end. It thinks it can go on forever, but it can't, because in the end, capitalism, born of mass death, wants to return to its origin. Like in the end, the oceans will have no oxygen, right? In the end, the aquifers will be filled with carcinogens. In the end, the wild destruction of species will come back to include us. In the end, the nuclear devices will poison everything. In the end, the polar ice is gone. In the end, capitalism, which is nothing but killing, and the infinite expansion of that killing is going to infinitely expand and consume us all. So we don't really even have a choice but to do what Bobby Seale said, seize the time. And I think we know we can, because when we organize 2 or 3 together or more with an idea that because we should do this thing, we can do it, and where the thing is feeding the hungry, bringing water to the thirsty, clothing people dressed in rags, medicine for the sick, hospitality for the refugees, and freedom from incarceration, from the abomination of desolation. We know we can do it. So their world depends on our being on bended knee. They only have the power we give them.
Thank you. I want to open the floor for questions if there are some questions from the audience.
This is a question from our remote audience. It says, I also have a question about home ownership. It's 6 o'clock. Gentrification. I am a person of color and an artist. I can only afford homes in gentrifying areas. I identify first as a woman of color, but I'm also contributing to the colonial structure if I move and own a home in a gentrifying neighborhood because I am an artist. How do I help break the cycle of displacement?
Oh, wait, is that question for me or for everyone?
That is for you.
That's a great question. I don't know. What's on your mind? What are you thinking of doing to break the cycle?
So I think that was a question from the remote, from the Q&A, from a remote audience. So I don't know if they can respond to you that quickly.
Oh, I see. Well, maybe my panelists haven't. This feels a bit specific to Pittsburgh, and I feel that there are great Pittsburgh answers out there. I love your fair city. I've been there many times. But I don't know if I'm ready yet to give grounded answers for you.
So I'm
You know,
going to punt it to Jamil.
Well, I'll do my best, but I'm not sure that, I mean, that seems like a false equivalency. It doesn't seem like a fair question to have when you have a housing market, like Pittsburgh's, where so many areas of the city for so long have just been disinvested, where there's no value for Black home ownership. And, homes that families bought in the 60s are worth about the same dollar value today. The idea of accumulation of wealth. And so when you've crossed a threshold in so many of these neighborhoods where the properties, artists moving in, and now you're the scapegoat for bringing arts to a neighborhood, and you've helped usher in a wave of gentrifiers. I don't think, I don't buy that whole premise, because I think that there are so many other bigger, wealthier developers that have already spoiled this pot. And so I don't know if that's a fair question to ask yourself, since there is no black or white answer to that one. I mean, that's one of those things. I don't know if that's the right frame for that question.
What Jamil said. I also think that we want to think hard about being presented with sort of paradoxes of individualism, right? That do what you can, do what feels good, get with people who are doing things that they can do that feel good and achievable to you. That will work if we're all doing it and realizing that we can solve these problems, and not just by channeling it all through, not solely by channeling it all through the structures that are out there designed to dissipate our energy. So it's maybe not specific, but we're so often made to think that these are problems of individual morality and not problems of capitalist exploitation, like big capitalist exploitation. There's no reason in this country why there isn't housing for every single person that is decent and good. There's no reason why it's not free. There's no reason why everyone can't have a living wage, whether they work or choose not to work. That's no less than what Martin Luther King advocated at the end, the King of 1960s, April 4, 67 to April 4, 68, said everybody deserves a living wage, whether they can work or not, whether they choose to work or not, and decent housing.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Professor Farley and Dr. Bay and Dr. Reed Vasquez for sharing with us today. And I also want to thank Van for setting the tone for the conversation with their poem. Thank you, Dr. Farley, for reminding us about the impossibility of justice through the law itself. There's no justice without our collective actions, and our collective actions that are outside of the law. Without that, without the struggle, there is no possibility of justice. And I think this is an important tone to set for the rest of the series that we are going to continue to have. Before we end the program today, I have to thank not only the panelists, but I also have to thank the Heinz Endowments, the Everly Foundation, PublicSource, who has been supporting the Apartheid series, the law school staff that put this in-person event and hybrid event together after 2 years of no in-person event, and they did a wonderful job. The Apartheid series working group, everyone that's watching through Zoom, everyone that made it here after so long and braved your comfort zone and the beautiful weather that we had outside competing with us today. This is just but the beginning of the work of the center and the beginning of the series. The series continues with community dialogues that start April 1st to share the conversations with the community, with the hope, and I'm gonna paraphrase and steal something from Zan, in hope to develop and build an American version of America that includes all of us. Thank you, all of you, for being here, and to the panelists.